It's not every day you roll out of bed, sip your morning espresso, and find your Ferrari coughing up blood like it just swallowed a cup of syrup. That's what it sounded like anyway, an expensive sputter, then silence. No engine purr. No dashboard glow. Just a quiet death in the driveway. At first, I thought maybe I'd left it in valet mode or something stupid like that. I walked over, opened the hood, and that's when the smell hit me. Sweet. Not like oil or fuel. Like candy. Like sugar. And the second I popped open the fuel tank, I knew. Someone had poured sugar into my Ferrari. I stood there blinking, taking in the horror and absurdity. Then I glanced up at the camera mounted above the garage. My glorious 4K, night vision, motion-triggered, cloud-backed little friend. I smiled. Because I already had a very strong suspicion of who it was, and I was pretty sure she'd just signed a check her HOA seat couldn't cash. I had moved into the neighborhood just 3 months ago. I wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. Some waved, sure. Others glared. But Karen made it her mission to personally despise me. She was somewhere in her late 40s, always strutting around in loud floral blouses like she was running for mayor of Stepford, and wielded her HOA position like a medieval sword. She lived 3 doors down with her Shih Tzu, Harold, who barked more than a smoke alarm in a burning Waffle House. From day one, Karen had a problem with my car. It was too red, too loud, too Italian, too everything. She'd leave passive-aggressive notes on my door, cite non-existent HOA codes, and even one time stood in front of my driveway at 7 a.m. just to take photos while muttering something about carbon emissions. Meanwhile, Harold pooped on my lawn every morning, and somehow that didn't violate anything. At first, I treated her like an overzealous sitcom character. I smiled. I waved. I even sent over a basket of muffins with a card that read, "Sorry my car offends your lawn gnome aesthetic." But Karen didn't like humor. She liked control. And when control slipped, she got spiteful. She started complaining to the HOA board that my Ferrari violated the community ambience. When that didn't work, she tried reporting it as a commercial vehicle. I wish I was kidding. Her final straw seemed to be when I got it detailed and installed undercarriage lighting. Not for showing off, mind you, just because it looked cool when I parked it in the driveway at night. The next day, she accused me of turning the cul-de-sac into a drag strip. I offered to let her drive it so she'd understand the art of good taste. She walked away muttering threats about property values. I thought it would stop there. I underestimated how unhinged Karen could be when cornered by a shiny engine and an owner who didn't bow to her self-made rules. But sabotaging my car? That wasn't just petty, it was criminal. I stood there on the driveway, glancing between the damaged fuel system and my security camera. I didn't even need to check the footage. I already knew what I'd find. Still, for due diligence and the absolute thrill of it, I went inside and pulled up the cloud archive. 2 nights ago, 1:44 a.m. There she was, bathrobe flapping in the wind, hair in chaos, clutching what looked like a baking supplies bag and a small red funnel. She crept across her lawn like she was in Mission Impossible, except Tom Cruise never had a dog leash in one hand and a bag of domino sugar in the other. Harold trailed behind her like a loyal accomplice. She looked both ways, poured sugar into my tank like it was a cup of tea, then scampered off. It was so ridiculous I had to rewind it just to laugh again. I wasn't even angry. I was fascinated. Here was a woman who had declared war on an inanimate object, and by extension, me. And she didn't even try to hide it. She didn't wear gloves. She didn't mask up. Just full Karen energy caught in glorious HD. So I did what any rational adult would do. I called my lawyer. To be clear, I wasn't the kind of guy who jumped to lawsuit. But this wasn't a scratched bumper or a bad Yelp review. This was deliberate destruction of property worth a small fortune. I wasn't about to let it slide just because the person who did it dressed like she was sponsored by Pier 1 Import. My lawyer, Max, was the kind of guy who used phrases like "let's bury them" and walked into court like it was an MMA cage. He nearly choked on his sandwich when I showed him the footage. By the next morning, we had two things. A full mechanics report confirming sugar in the fuel system had destroyed the fuel injectors, lines, and engine components to the tune of over $40,000, and a civil lawsuit filed with Karen's name on it. It wasn't just property damage. It was malicious intent. We added emotional distress for good measure. Not because I was crying into my pillow, but because watching your car turn into a paperweight overnight tends to ruin your weekend. Karen didn't react at first. I figured maybe she hadn't received the papers yet. That changed 2 days later during a Sunday brunch she was hosting for the HOA board in her backyard. White tablecloths, cucumber sandwiches, bad jazz playing off a Bluetooth speaker. Max sent a process server who walked straight into the middle of it all, asked for Karen, and handed her the envelope. Karen turned the color of boiled shrimp. She started shrieking about lies and harassment and how she was going to sue me for defamation. Then she looked across the street and saw me standing on my porch sipping coffee, waving politely. She screamed louder. Harold barked. Someone knocked over a tray of deviled eggs. Now things were rolling. I wasn't just dealing with an angry neighbor anymore. I was dealing with someone who thought she could destroy a six-figure car and walk away because she had a clipboard and access to the HOA WhatsApp group. But the real kicker? Karen had no idea what kind of financial trouble she was in. See, lawsuits are funny things. They start with a bang and end with silence if you don't have the money to fight. Karen was about to find out that sugar in a tank might be sweet, but revenge was even sweeter. The morning after Karen's brunch meltdown, the entire neighborhood buzzed like a kicked beehive. Apparently, word had spread faster than her lemonade tea. The image of a process server crashing her pristine backyard affair had become local legend overnight. Some neighbors pretended to be shocked, others whispered like high schoolers. A few even stopped by to casually ask if the rumors were true. I just smiled and said, "You'll want to bring popcorn to the court date." What I didn't say was that this wasn't going to be a simple property damage claim. Karen thought this was a petty squabble between neighbors. She had no idea I was about to drop a financial nuke on her front lawn. By Monday, Max had already prepped the next move. We filed for a full civil suit with not just property damage but punitive damages, legal fees, and emotional stress. The last part was mostly for leverage, but it made the total number look impressive enough to make her sweat. The mechanics report detailed the exact damage caused by the sugar, destroyed injectors, contaminated fuel lines, warped valves. It was like Karen had fed my Ferrari a bag of death candy. And the repair quote was a beautiful thing, just north of $43,000. That, plus legal fees and damages, brought our claim to a neat $63,000 and some change. The goal was never to bleed her dry. It was to make her feel exactly how I felt watching that car die in my driveway. Helpless, stunned, and very, very ticked off. Karen, of course, tried to bluff. She stomped around the neighborhood telling everyone it was a misunderstanding. She claimed she was feeding raccoons. No, seriously, she told someone she was pouring sugar to lure away pests. As if the footage didn't exist. When that didn't gain sympathy, she pivoted to outrage. She said I was suing her because I couldn't handle a strong woman on the HOA board. I don't know how vandalizing a luxury sports car became an act of female empowerment, but in Karen's world, logic was a tourist. She even tried to file a counterclaim accusing me of harassment, claiming that my security cameras were pointed at her property, which they weren't. Max laughed so hard at that one he actually snorted. Things really got entertaining when Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. She tried to convince the board that I was a nuisance and should be penalized for bringing legal drama into the neighborhood. She even brought a slideshow presentation printed from Microsoft Word, with screenshots of my Ferrari undercarriage lights and captions like toxic influence and vehicular intimidation. I sat in the back row sipping a can of Sprite like it was a movie. When she finished, I raised my hand and asked if she planned to include the part where she trespassed and destroyed personal property. The room went quiet. Then I offered to play the footage for anyone who hadn't seen it. Karen turned a shade of gray I didn't know skin could achieve. That's when the HOA president, a guy named Gary who normally only spoke when a shrub was out of code, cleared his throat and asked Karen if she wanted to continue pressing the issue. She said nothing. She just gathered her papers, muttered something about legal overreach, and walked out. For the first time since I moved in, the rest of the board looked at me not like a problem, but like someone who had just saved them from future embarrassment. Later that evening, Gary showed up at my door. He awkwardly thanked me for handling things quietly and said Karen was going to be suspended from board duties until the case was resolved. I didn't laugh until he left. Suspended from the HOA board. To Karen, that probably felt like being excommunicated from royalty. A week passed. Then two. Karen's swagger deflated. No more shrill morning rants on the neighborhood group chat. No more passive-aggressive dog walking across my driveway. She seemed to be lying low. Which made me curious, so I did a little digging. Public records aren't hard to access when you know where to look, and Max was a wizard with court databases. What we found was almost too good to be true. Karen was leveraged to the eyeballs. Her house had a second mortgage. She had outstanding credit card debt. And best of all, her property taxes were overdue. That lawsuit wasn't just inconvenient, it was financially catastrophic. If the judgment went through, she'd be forced to sell. The house she fought so hard to preserve from the horror of my Ferrari could end up in foreclosure. I didn't gloat. Not openly. But I did park a rental car in the same shade of red in my driveway just to see if she'd react. She didn't. I think by then she knew the walls were closing in. When the court date finally arrived, Karen walked in wearing a blazer that looked like it came from a discount cruise ship uniform. She had a new lawyer, someone who looked like he'd just passed the bar last Tuesday. Max and I sat calmly, watching her squirm as the case began. The footage was entered into evidence. The judge asked if she had any rebuttal. Her lawyer said the video was inconclusive. Max asked if he was watching the same clip where she literally poured a substance into my gas tank under the cover of night. The judge agreed. Karen then tried to claim that it wasn't sugar, just a harmless prank. That fell apart when Max presented the chemical analysis from the repair shop showing glucose and sucrose traces in the damaged component. She tried to pivot again, claiming I'd harassed her by filming her property. The judge asked where that footage was. Karen had none. She stuttered. Her lawyer stared at the table like he wanted to sink into it. The best moment came when Max, during cross-examination, asked Karen what she was doing outside at 1:44 in the morning with a funnel and a sugar bag. She stammered something about insomnia and baking. Max asked if she regularly baked while walking her dog near other people's cars. Karen said yes. The courtroom chuckled. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. At that point, the case was basically over. The judge announced that the evidence overwhelmingly supported our claim. Karen was ordered to pay full damages, legal fees, and a fine for trespassing. She tried to protest, but it was no use. The gavel dropped. Judgment was passed. Karen's face fell like a building in slow motion. Outside the courtroom, Max patted my back and said it was one of the easiest wins he'd ever had. I thanked him and said this was probably the first time Karen had lost anything in her life that wasn't a dog show. She left without speaking to anyone, her lawyer trailing behind her looking like he needed a vacation. I got into my rental and pulled out of the parking lot, my mood lighter than it had been in weeks. But the best part wasn't the judgment. It wasn't even the check that would soon cover the Ferrari's repair. It was knowing what would happen next. Karen couldn't afford $60,000. Not without selling. And thanks to the little financial reconnaissance Max had done, I knew she didn't have enough room to refinance either. She was going to have to put her house on the market. She would have no choice. And when she did, I was going to be waiting. Not with sugar. Not with sabotage. but with cash. And a plan. One that would flip this entire story on its head. Because if Karen thought losing a court case was bad, she was about to learn what it felt like to hand me the keys to her kingdom. The next few days after the court ruling were almost too quiet. Karen didn't storm around the neighborhood like usual, didn't post furious HOA updates, and for the first time since I moved in, Harold the Shih Tzu wasn't using my lawn as his personal toilet. It was like she vanished into the walls of her house. The grapevine told me she'd called in sick to the HOA and hadn't answered her door in days. I wasn't surprised. $63,000 doesn't exactly disappear from a couch cushion. And knowing what we had uncovered about her finances, it was only a matter of time before the next domino fell. I didn't even have to lift a finger. Her own actions had set off a chain reaction that would do all the work for me. The only thing I had to decide was whether I wanted front row seats or to play the long game. Naturally, I picked both. It wasn't hard to figure out what would happen next. Karen didn't have enough in savings to pay the judgment. The bank would be the first to notice the crack forming. Mortgage payments that were already behind would now tip over the edge. She might try to delay, stall, beg for mercy. But I had already heard from a friend at the county office that she'd received a final notice on her property taxes. The clock was ticking. The queen of HOA tyranny was officially broke and bleeding. And just when it looked like she might find a miracle, I decided to offer one myself, under very specific terms. Max and I formed an LLC. A simple shell company, nothing flashy, just something neutral-sounding and bland enough that no one would blink twice. Then, when Karen officially listed the house, our agent swooped in. She had no idea who the buyer was. She thought she was escaping her legal nightmare, selling to a faceless investment group looking for properties in her neighborhood. The price was lower than market value because she needed a fast exit, but still high enough to make her feel like she'd won something back. What she didn't know was that she was handing her home directly to the man whose Ferrari she tried to murder with kitchen supplies. Some people buy victory trophies. I prefer real estate. Watching her during the final home inspection was a surreal experience. I wasn't there in person, but our real estate agent kept me updated. Karen acted nervous, twitchy, overly friendly in that fake way she used when she was trying to manipulate the outcome. She offered water bottles, asked about closing timelines, pretended she wasn't drowning in debt. The agent played it cool, nodded politely, and took note. Everything looked good. The house was structurally solid. Slightly dated in taste, sure, but nothing a renovation couldn't fix. The best part? She had left a hand-painted sign on the kitchen wall that read, "This house runs on love, laughter, and HOA rules." I told the contractor to leave that up just long enough for me to take a photo with it later. The official sale closed on a sunny Thursday afternoon. The paperwork came through, and with a few digital signatures and wire transfers, Karen was out. I was in. The house was mine. The same house she had once used as her throne, her command post, her neighborhood surveillance bunker. Now I owned it. She hadn't even packed everything yet. There were still potted plants by the entryway, and a few of her beloved wind chimes jingled in the backyard like they didn't know the regime had fallen. She was given one final week to remove her things. One final week before she'd have to drive away from the block she tried to rule like a HOA dictator. And still, she had no idea. I didn't plan to tell her. Not yet. Let her leave in ignorance, thinking she got away with something. But fate had other plans. On her last day, Karen showed up at the house to collect a few final items. I happened to be pulling into the driveway in my freshly repaired Ferrari. She froze mid-step, holding a potted hydrangea, her jaw visibly clenching as she registered the sound of the engine she once tried to destroy. I stepped out casually, sunglasses on, pretending I hadn't noticed her. She called out to me with a voice full of sugar and venom, asking if I was lost. I told her no, just checking on my new investment property. Her face crumpled, confused. Then it hit her. She asked what I meant by investment. I told her I bought the house, her house, through a shell company, that it now belonged to me, and that I had plans for it, renovations, maybe a short-term rental, or maybe I'd just leave it empty for a year, just because I could. Her face drained of color. She stuttered, asking how, when, why. I just smiled and told her that when you dump sugar in a six-figure car, don't be surprised if karma buys your mortgage out from under you. She looked like she might drop the plant. Harold barked weakly from the passenger seat of her car, probably sensing the psychic collapse of his human. She started yelling then. About fairness, about abuse of power, about revenge. She claimed I had stalked her, harassed her, bullied her. I reminded her that she had committed a felony against my vehicle. That she had lied, manipulated, and tried to ruin my reputation with the HOA. She said that was different. I asked how. She didn't answer. Just stood there trembling, surrounded by her final possessions, while the symbol of everything she hated idled behind me. The Ferrari purred like a satisfied cat. Eventually, she left. No dramatic exit, no slamming of doors. Just a quiet walk back to her car, defeated and silent. I stood on the porch of what used to be her castle, sipping a bottle of water she had left in the fridge. The air tasted sweeter than sugar ever could. The victory wasn't in the courtroom. It wasn't in the dollar amount. It was in that exact moment, watching her realize that all her scheming, all her sabotage, had led to her giving me the very thing she once used to try and control me. Later that evening, a few of the neighbors dropped by. Most of them had heard the story by then, or at least bits and pieces. They wanted to know if it was true. If I had really bought Karen's house. If she was really gone. I nodded. Someone brought wine. Another brought barbecue. We sat on the back patio, the one she had used for all her uptight HOA events, and shared laughs over grilled ribs and ridiculous neighborhood stories. Someone joked about renaming the block from Maple Ridge Circle to Karma Lane. I didn't disagree. The next morning, I found the final surprise. Tucked into a kitchen drawer was a stack of HOA meeting notes, handwritten in looping cursive. Pages and pages of complaints about me. About my car. About how the neighborhood had fallen from grace. Each one more absurd than the last. I flipped through them with amusement, stopping only when I found a list labeled Emergency HOA Eviction Options. The final bullet point simply said, Ferrari must go. I laughed. Then I folded the note and tucked it into a frame. It now sits proudly on the living room mantel of her former home, right above the Ferrari key display. Karen didn't just lose a court case. She lost her power, her home, her self-made kingdom. All because she couldn't handle someone driving a red car. And I didn't even have to raise my voice. All I had to do was let the engine roar, press record, and trust that karma, like a Ferrari, always delivers. If there was ever a perfect blend of poetic justice and legal precision, it happened the day Karen tried to contest the damages. Apparently, after our little driveway showdown where she realized she had unknowingly sold her house to the man she once tried to sabotage, she didn't crawl away quietly into her next misadventure. She filed an appeal, claimed the verdict was unfair, the lawsuit malicious, and accused me of orchestrating a conspiracy to financially ruin her. She even tried to call it entrapment, as if my Ferrari was some kind of bait trap and she was a helpless raccoon who just couldn't resist dumping sugar in it. It would have been hilarious if it weren't filed in a real court with real documents. I got the notice 2 weeks after she moved out. My first reaction was laughter. My second was picking up the phone to call Max, who nearly choked on his drink when I read him her claims. He said it was the legal equivalent of throwing a tantrum in a courtroom and that he couldn't wait to respond. We scheduled a hearing date, which Karen's new attorney, number 3, by the way, insisted was necessary because his client was under duress and didn't fully understand the implications of the judgment. I half expected them to claim she was sleepwalking when she poured the sugar. Leading up to the hearing, Max and I prepped. He combed through every piece of evidence we had, cross-referenced timestamps, compiled mechanic reports, receipts, and even a local weather report just to prove that visibility was clear the night she vandalized the car. He wanted the appeal not just denied, but demolished. Karen, on the other hand, tried to rally sympathy. She submitted a packet of letters claiming hardship, blamed the economy, and even stated in one section that the incident had left her emotionally unstable. The irony of reading that while I stood in her former kitchen, sipping espresso under the same ceiling fan she once dusted with righteous HOA fury, was almost too good. The day of the appeal hearing arrived with overcast skies and tension thick enough to slice with a butter knife. Karen walked into the courtroom looking more fragile than before, wearing a somber outfit that screamed carefully curated victim. Her attorney did most of the talking, arguing that the footage was inconclusive, that my reaction was disproportionate, and that Karen's actions were not malicious but the result of emotional distress from alleged bullying. That part made me actually glance around the courtroom to see if I was on a hidden camera show. Max stood, cool as ever, and delivered what I can only describe as a surgical takedown. He walked the court through the footage again, this time with even clearer enhancements. Karen, in full resolution, funnel in hand, sugar bag clearly labeled, crouched by the fuel tank in her bathrobe like a criminal in a sitcom. He reminded the court that she had lied under oath in the first trial by claiming she didn't do it, then tried to spin the story after the footage surfaced. He produced a timeline of her HOA complaints, proving a long-standing obsession with my car. He even read snippets from the HOA notes I had found in her kitchen drawer. My favorite was the one where she suggested the community look into a noise ordinance to ban vehicles with an exhaust louder than her dog's bark. The court chuckled. Karen shrunk into her chair. Then came the mechanic. We had subpoenaed the technician who worked on the Ferrari, and he came prepared. He explained how sugar doesn't just vanish from a fuel system, how it hardens and clogs every delicate part it touches. He detailed the labor involved in tearing apart the engine, flushing lines, replacing components, and the cost associated with that level of precision work. Karen's lawyer tried to object, claiming it was too technical. The judge allowed it. After all, Karen had claimed the sugar did no real damage. Hearing the itemized list shut that claim down like a locked vault, Karen finally took the stand. Her voice trembled as she repeated her narrative of feeling targeted, isolated, emotionally overwhelmed. She mentioned losing her house, suffering public humiliation, and stated that I had paraded around her downfall with pride. That last part was technically true, but not legally relevant. Then Max stood for cross-examination. He started soft, asking her why she chose to take matters into her own hands instead of filing a formal complaint through proper HOA channels. She said she didn't believe it would work. He asked if that justified property destruction. She said no. He asked if she had poured sugar in my fuel tank. She hesitated, then nodded. Yes. That was it. Game over. She had just admitted guilt again, under oath, in her own appeal. The judge didn't even wait long to issue a ruling. The appeal was denied. The original judgment stood. Karen was now not only on the hook for the original damages and court fees, but also the additional costs associated with the appeal itself. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. Karen burst into tears. Real ones this time. But if they were meant to sway anyone, they were a few gallons of fuel too late. After the hearing, Max and I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. I asked him how many cases had ended with a full confession in an appeal. He said never. We shook hands, laughed, and parted ways. I climbed into my Ferrari, freshly cleaned and running smoother than ever. As I pulled away from the courthouse, I saw Karen sitting alone on a bench, face in her hands, surrounded by papers she probably couldn't afford to process anymore. I didn't stop. That chapter was over. Back at the house, now fully mine and fully renovated, I felt something shift. Not just the satisfaction of justice, but the realization that the chaos Karen brought into the neighborhood had finally been replaced with calm. I finished converting her old craft room into a soundproof home theater, the backyard into a minimalist Zen garden, and that tacky HOA wall sign into a framed joke that guests love. Every corner of the house now reflected peace instead of pettiness. A week later, I received a letter. Not from Karen, but from her sister. A polite, apologetic note explaining that Karen had moved in with her temporarily, and asking if I would consider selling the house back to the family for sentimental reasons. I didn't respond. There was no price that could match the poetic balance that had been restored. Karen made a choice, and that choice cost her everything she used to wield power. It wasn't just a legal loss. It was the loss of the illusion that she could bully, manipulate, and sabotage without consequence. I wasn't out for revenge anymore. That part was already written in bold across the deed of the house and the mileage count on my car. What remained was a quiet, consistent reminder that sometimes karma doesn't knock. Sometimes it revs its engine in your driveway and waits patiently while you grab the funnel. By the time summer settled in, the house that once stood as Karen's personal HOA throne had transformed into something unrecognizable. The overgrown rose bushes she used to obsessively trim were replaced with desert landscaping and native succulents that required zero HOA approval. Her garish garden gnomes were long gone, replaced with a minimalist stone water feature. The porch no longer had seasonal flags fluttering for obscure holidays. It had become what it was always meant to be, a peaceful home, not a battlefield for one woman's power trip. And through it all, the Ferrari sat gleaming in the driveway, not just restored but upgraded. Karen had tried to destroy something she didn't understand, and in the process, gifted me the most ironic full-circle victory I could ever imagine. It was funny how quiet the neighborhood had become. Without Karen's constant watchful eye, people relaxed. They started planting flowers outside of regulation. Some even painted their shutters without permission. It was chaos by her standards and harmony by mine. The HOA board, now under new leadership, had softened their tone. Gary, the former president, actually smiled now. A neighbor I had never even spoken to before approached me while walking his dog and thanked me. Said the place finally felt like a neighborhood again, not a community under surveillance. I told him it wasn't me. It was the absence of one person's need to control everyone else's joy. I didn't think much about Karen after the appeal. It wasn't that I forgot about her. You don't forget someone who commits felony vandalism on a $250,000 car and then cries victim about it. It's just that she no longer lived rent-free in my head. The war was over. The dust had settled. But then one day, as I was cleaning out the garage and reorganizing boxes that came with the house, I found something wedged behind a cabinet. It was a photo album. Old, dusty, and labeled in block letters with her name and the year she moved in. I almost tossed it aside, thinking it was just sentimental clutter, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside were photos of a younger Karen, smiling wide, holding up keys in front of the house, standing with what looked like a now ex-husband and a much younger Harold on her hip. There were pictures of her planting those infamous roses, decorating for the holidays, even hosting what seemed to be a block party. It was bizarre to see her like that, before the power, before the bitterness. There was something almost human there. I flipped through silently, noting how the joy in the pictures faded the further I went. By the last few pages, she was alone. No husband, no friends in the shot. Just her, and her obsession with order, decorating her lawn like a showroom nobody visited. I set the album aside, not out of spite, but out of respect for the strange complexity of it all. Karen wasn't just a villain. She was a person who had built a kingdom out of walls and rules, and when it cracked, she didn't know how to survive without it. It didn't excuse what she did, not even close, but it made the story richer. Messier. More real. Then came the final twist I never saw coming. A few weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to me with no return name. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, sharp, deliberate, rigid. I opened it on the porch, half expecting a final jab, another accusation, or maybe a veiled threat wrapped in passive-aggressive phrasing. But it wasn't any of those things. It was a letter of apology. In it, Karen admitted everything. She explained her resentment toward me wasn't about the car, not entirely. She wrote about how she had watched her life shrink, her marriage ending, her finances unraveling, her family moving away, and how the Ferrari in the driveway felt like a reminder of everything she no longer had. She called her actions inexcusable but honest. She said that when she saw me drive it around the neighborhood, it wasn't the noise that bothered her. It was the joy. She couldn't stand seeing someone so comfortable in his own skin, so unaffected by rules that she had wrapped herself in like armor. She ended the letter by saying she had left the town entirely, moved in with her sister 2 states over, and didn't plan on returning. She said she hoped the house brought me peace, not bitterness. That last line stuck with me more than it should have. I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of the album, not out of sentiment, but because it felt like the final page of a very twisted chapter. The irony, of course, is that the house did bring peace. Not just because of the victory, but because of what it represented. I hadn't just won a lawsuit. I had reclaimed space, physical and mental, that Karen had tried to control. My Ferrari wasn't just running again, it was better than ever. I drove it without hesitation now, without that slight nagging worry that some HOA ghoul was watching from behind the blinds. The sound of the engine, once used by Karen as her rallying cry for rules and regulation, had become a symbol of everything she failed to destroy. I threw a backyard party in late August. Just a small gathering. A few friends, some neighbors, music, food, laughter. Nothing extravagant, but enough to fill the yard with good energy. At one point during the evening, someone walked inside and pointed at the photo album on the coffee table. They asked if it belonged to a previous owner. I nodded. They asked if she was as bad as the stories claimed. I said worse. But then I paused and added that she wasn't always that way. That maybe the house itself had become too much of a mirror for her. That maybe all she saw in it by the end was what she lost. Nobody quite knew what to say to that, but the mood didn't shift. We raised our glasses anyway. To karma. To survival. To letting go. And to the strange, unpredictable road that brings people in and out of your life with the roar of an engine and a trail of powdered sugar. As the evening ended and people trickled out, I stood on the porch, watching the lights dim across the neighborhood. The quiet was warm now, not tense. No one was policing lawn height or measuring mailbox angles. The air didn't carry judgment anymore. Just cicadas and the distant sound of someone laughing inside their home. I walked back inside, flipped off the porch light, and passed the framed note on the mantel. It still made me chuckle. Ferrari must go, it read, scrawled in Karen's handwriting, lifted from her old HOA note. Right below it sat the Ferrari key fob on a marble tray, glinting under the soft light. A full circle if there ever was one. And just like that, the story was over. Not in fire or fury, but in silence. Not with vengeance, but with the kind of peace that only comes when you let the past crash and burn, and then calmly build something better from the ashes. The sugar had melted, the engine had roared back to life, and the Queen of Rules had abdicated her throne. I didn't have to fight anymore. The house was mine. The road ahead was open, and the only thing left to do was drive.